One day, during a school event, the principal throws out a half-joking question. Do you want to do something useful? Show us how you play the piano. Everyone laughs. Someone turns on the phone. Everyone is expecting failure. But when Elijah sits down at the instrument, everything changes. In the faded heart of Lincoln Heights, a neighborhood where every cracked sidewalk and dim streetlight told its own story of hardship, Elijah Walker's world was built from the quiet resilience of survival and the tender echoes of a love long past. Born into a family whose means were few but whose dreams burned bright in intermittent bursts of hope, Elijah grew up in a modest apartment above a rundown row house. Not much had changed in that part of the city for decades, and the neighborhood's colors were as muted as the worn drapes that no longer blocked the searing summer sun. Here, in this oft-forgotten quarter, every day was a struggle against a tide of indifference, and every night a battle to preserve the memory of those who had given all their love. Before the world turned its back on him, Elijah's mother had been the heart of their small family. Her radiant smile, gentle laugh, and soulful determination had been the guiding light for a boy whose quiet nature betrayed an inner fire waiting to be unleashed. Despite her own burdens, chronic illness, a meager income, and the sorrow of dreams deferred, she filled their home with a soft music that resonated with hope. The piano, an ancient, battered instrument that had belonged to her own mother, occupied a precarious spot in their tiny living room. Its keys, though scuffed and some chipped from years of use, carried the melodies of yesteryears. Lullabies sung in the twilight of difficult days, intricate ballads that broke the silence of loneliness, and soulful improvisations that spoke of both agony and beauty. It was on this piano that she had first coaxed a melody out of Elijah, teaching him to listen, not just with his ears, but with his heart. Elijah, a quiet and withdrawn boy from the impoverished corridors of his neighborhood, had learned early that words were often met with ridicule and misunderstanding. At school, he was never invited to join the bustling conversations that echoed through the hallowed halls of Lincoln Heights Academy, a prestigious institution where tradition and appearances reigned supreme. Instead, he was dismissed as the quiet one, a problematic student whose silence was more a symptom of not belonging than a true reflection of his inner thoughts. His threadbare clothes, hand-me-downs that clung to his slight frame, became a beacon for the mockery of those who could not see past the sheen of wealth and privilege. Teachers, wrapped in the insulated opinions of their socially elevated peers, casually passed him over, often labeling him as disruptive for his aloofness, a trait they misinterpreted as defiance rather than the quiet introspection born of hardship. At home, however, the piano was Elijah's sanctuary, a silent confidant that helped him understand the language of his own heart. In the small hours of the night, when the city hushed its boisterous clamor and the neon lights dimmed into murmurings of regret, Elijah would press his fingers tentatively against the worn keys. Every note that quivered through the air was laden with memories. The soft hum of his mother's lullabies, the bittersweet reminiscence of laughter shared over simple meals, and the unspoken promises made in the comforting glow of a single, flickering lamp. Music became his refuge, a medium that allowed him to express the feelings that language refused to hold. Although his voice rarely joined the chorus of his classmates, his heart had learned to sing in a harmony uniquely his own, a melody forged from loss and love, sorrow and hope. The battered piano, its mahogany frame scarred by decades of constant use, was more than just an instrument. It was the embodiment of all that Elijah's mother had ever believed in. Even after she passed away, her spirit seemed woven into the very fibers of the piano's keys. Her final lesson, imparted in soft whispers during quiet evenings, was that true beauty often emerges from the places most forsaken. And so, every time Elijah played, he felt her presence. He remembered her gentle encouragement, wiping away any hesitance with the warmth of her voice. Though his fingers sometimes trembled over the keys, as if the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm him, with each hesitant chord he discovered a part of himself that no one had dared to acknowledge. A soul that, though battered by life's relentless abuses, still held unyielding dignity and innate brilliance. As he grew older, the contrast between his home life and the cold corridors of Lincoln Heights Academy became ever starker. In school, where polished uniforms and prestigious lineage were de rigueur, Elijah's poverty and reticence set him apart as an outsider. The teacher's curt stares and classmates' dismissive whispers echoed in his mind, each incident a reminder of how different he was in a world that prized extroverted confidence and superficial success. And yet, within the sanctuary of his own memories and the worn keys of that battered piano, Elijah nurtured a secret strength, a quiet promise that, one day, his inner music would outshine the silence imposed upon him. In those early years, Elijah often wondered if the music he played might someday serve as his passport to something greater, a way to bridge the chasm between who he was thrust to be and who he secretly longed to become. The tender memories of his mother's unwavering love became a personal anthem, a benediction that assured him that sometimes, the most profound voices in the world are the ones that speak only through silence and song. Though the world outside seemed determined to keep him at the margins, that old piano whispered a different story. A story of resilience, of dignity, and of an inner light that, once unleashed, could transform humiliation into triumph. Inside the imposing corridors of Lincoln Heights Academy, a prestigious institution where every polished surface and embroidered crest boasted a legacy of tradition and unyielding conformity, Elijah Walker navigated his days like a ghost in a foreign land. The ornate hallways, lit by the gleam of vintage chandeliers and echoing with the orchestrated cadence of daily routines, offered no refuge for a boy whose very existence challenged the very fabric of this meticulously curated world. Here, amid the marble floors and stately classrooms, the weight of prejudice and the sting of indifference followed him on every step. Every morning, as his peers arrived in freshly pressed uniforms and bespoke accessories, Elijah's threadbare clothes and worn shoes betrayed the silent story of his humble origins. The whispers in the halls were immediate and relentless, a chorus of subtle mockery reserved for the boy who seemed too quiet, too different. The teachers, custodians of the academy's storied tradition, regarded him with a mixture of condescension and wary disapproval. In their eyes, his silence was not a mark of thoughtful reserve but a problem to be managed, a deviation from the extroverted, sharp-witted persona they expected from students of elite pedigree. In the classroom, termination of ignorance was often presented as a sacred duty. Yet, Elijah's presence transformed each lesson into an unspoken display of social hierarchy. His seat, tucked away in the back corner of a classroom lined with heavy, dark wood desks and an abundance of inspirational quotes hanging in gilt frames, became a symbol of isolation. While other students engaged eagerly in debates and group projects, Elijah remained the quiet observer, a stark contrast that only further fueled both his classmates' and teachers' dismissive attitudes. A casual remark from a teacher during a literature discussion, "Elijah, perhaps you would like to share your thoughts for once?" was met with an awkward silence from him and a ripple of barely concealed smirks among his peers. His reticence, misinterpreted as defiance or lack of intellect, solidified his status as an outsider. Throughout the day, every interaction with the faculty further underscored the chasm between him and the world around him. In the hallowed corridors of Lincoln Heights, where tradition was worshipped as much as academic achievement, the subtle barbs of exclusion cut deeper than overt insults. Teachers would often label him as problematic, not because he disrupted classes, but because he spoke so little. His quiet existence served as a challenge to the Academy's unspoken doctrine. Conformity was a virtue and silence, a refusal to engage, was unforgivable. Even the principal, Director Cartwright, whose reputation was steeped in a blend of charismatic severity and a commitment to preserving the school's storied image, viewed Elijah's reticence as a departure from the expected student comportment. His dismissive glances and the offhand comments directed at Elijah in staff meetings conveyed the message that the boy's humble background and quietude were liabilities in a space where lineage and polished articulation reigned supreme. The social landscape among the student body was equally unforgiving. In bustling lunchrooms where laughter and boisterous chatter filled the air, Elijah often sat alone, his presence barely registered amidst a sea of privileged chatter and curated interactions. The other students, ensconced in their tight-knit cliques, found in him an easy target for ridicule. Whispers about his outdated clothing, the faded logo on his tie, and even the quiet dignity with which he bore his circumstances spread like wildfire. Phones were discreetly pulled out, and often, a snide remark about classic style or vintage poverty chic was shared among groups, each comment reinforcing a harsh stereotype. In these moments, Elijah's silence became an even more pronounced marker of difference, a clear sign that he did not, or could not, play by the rules of social hierarchy that the academy maintained. Yet beneath that veneer of neglect and condescension, Elijah's inner world thrived in quiet rebellion. Day after day, he retreated into a realm defined by the poignant memories of his small, loving home, a sanctuary far removed from the snarling indifference of the academy's polished halls. Every time a classmate laughed at him or a teacher dismissed his contributions, he silently returned to the recollections of his mother playing soft, soothing melodies on the battered piano that once graced their humble living room. That old piano, with its chipped keys and time-worn frame, had taught him that beauty often lay in the unadorned truth of one's feelings, a lesson that the cold, elitist corridors of Lincoln Heights Academy refused to acknowledge. During class discussions on art and history, when the subjects delved into themes of resilience and the human spirit, Elijah's gaze would wander wistfully out the window, as if searching for elusive echoes of a different world, one where his authenticity might be celebrated. But the moment soon passed, and he returned to his silent, reserved state, while the teachers chalked up his quietness as a flaw to be corrected in the pursuit of the academy's rigid standards. In the long, lonely hours between classes, as other students hurried across manicured lawns or clustered in fashionable groups, Elijah's solitary walks through quiet hallways spoke volumes. Behind those silent steps was an unspoken story, a narrative of perseverance, of a boy who had learned to find solace in the inner sanctuary of music and memory, despite the relentless specter of ridicule that shadowed him at school. For those who passed him in the corridors, Elijah was just another student, an indiscernible figure lost in the rigid tapestry of tradition and status. They could not see the spark of brilliance ignited in quiet solitude. They could not fathom that the very silence they equated with silence was, in truth, a prelude to a symphony yet to be heard, a symphony that would one day challenge every stereotype and prejudice that defined the halls of Lincoln Heights Academy. The day of the school event arrived with a mix of pomp and an undercurrent of condescension that was as customary at Lincoln Heights Academy as its time-worn traditions. In the grand, echoing auditorium, with its high, vaulted ceilings, plush red seats arranged in immaculate rows, and golden chandeliers casting a warm yet authoritarian glow, the elite establishment prepared for an evening of carefully orchestrated activities. The stage was set for performances that celebrated the century-old legacy of academic and cultural excellence. But amid the rehearsed recitals and flawlessly choreographed segments, one name lingered in the minds of those who already deemed him an outlier: Elijah Walker. Sitting quietly at the back, Elijah was a stark contrast to the luminous vibrance of his classmates. His presence was almost ghost-like, a solitary figure in ragged, well-worn clothing that set him apart from the polished uniforms and immaculate appearances of the other students. Already, whispers and snickers had begun to rise as he moved silently to his seat. No one expected anything more from the quiet boy, whose reticence had long been misconstrued as defiance or a sign of being a problem student. Instead, his silence had become a well-known badge of isolation, and today seemed no different. The event itself had started conventionally enough: awards presentations, student art displays, and brief speeches extolling the virtues of tradition and excellence. The atmosphere was embroidered with rehearsed praise for the Academy's storied history. Yet the moment of reckoning came unexpectedly. In the midst of the program, Director Cartwright, a man renowned for his unyielding adherence to tradition and his penchant for subtle cruelty masked in a jovial tone, stepped onto the stage. With a glint of mischief dancing in his eyes, he scanned the assembled crowd, his gaze falling upon Elijah. In a tone that was half jovial, half sardonic, he broke through the dignified formalities with a remark that sent an electric shiver through the room. "Now, if you'd like to do something useful for a change, Elijah, why don't you show us how they play classical music in the West Side?" A ripple of laughter burst forth from the audience. The remark was delivered with a smirk, and it was as if the very walls of the auditorium vibrated with the sound of derision. Phones were hurriedly raised. Screens flickered with anticipation as someone quickly began recording. The expectation was clear. The hall was poised to witness yet another public display of Elijah's inadequacy. A clumsy attempt at performance that would confirm every sneer and every whispered judgment. For a few heartbeats, the noise of ridicule and anticipation clashed in a dissonant chorus. The director's words had set the stage for an embarrassing spectacle. A moment designed to reduce the quiet, unassuming boy to an object of derision. Yet, as if propelled by an inner resolve that no outsider could fully fathom, Elijah slowly rose from his seat. Without a word or a glimpse of protest, he moved with an almost imperceptible determination toward the old piano that had stood quietly in one corner of the stage. The instrument, with its scarred keys and faded polish, seemed to wait patiently for its master. A relic bearing memories of an era long past, when music was more than a series of notes. It was an echo of heartfelt emotion. As Elijah reached the piano, the atmosphere shifted. Every eye in the auditorium fixed upon him, their earlier amusement transforming into a voyeuristic anticipation of failure. The director's smirk faltered ever so slightly as the murmurs settled into a heavy, expectant silence. For 10 long seconds, time itself appeared to slow, the only sound a distant ticking echo that underscored the tension. In that suspended moment, every sneer, every mocking whisper, and every presumptive laugh seemed to dissolve into a hushed expectancy of what was about to unfold. Then, without a word, Elijah sat down on the bench. His presence was somber. His eyes, dark with an intensity that belied his quiet exterior, glanced momentarily at the worn keys. In that silent exchange, the ghost of a long-ago memory stirred, the memory of a mother whose gentle touch had once coaxed melodies from that very piano. She had filled his childhood with music that was both tender and transformative, a language that spoke directly to his heart when words had failed him. With the softest, most deliberate motion, Elijah's fingers hovered over the keys. And suddenly, with a single, measured motion that seemed to summon the weight of all his unvoiced pain and hidden dignity, he began to play. The first note, a pure, resonant sound, floated freely through the auditorium, a sound that carried with it not the clumsy tremor of inexperience, but the soulful vibrato of a lifetime of silent longing. One note led to another, gradually building into a melancholic yet stirring melody that flowed like warm, bittersweet liquid over the cold, polished floor of the hall. The music that emerged was nothing short of transformative. It was as if the universe had conspired to pour into those notes the echoes of a mother's love, the weight of hardship borne in quiet defiance, and a beauty that the world had long refused to see. Each chord, each pause, resonated with the hidden struggles of a boy who had been judged by superficial standards. The sound was layered with emotion, an elegy of grief, hope, and the raw truth of his existence. The once cynical laughter of the audience faded into stunned silence. Phones that had been raised to capture his impending failure now recorded every trembling note with rapt attention. In those 10 seconds, the auditorium metamorphosed. The jeers of ridicule were replaced by an almost sacred quiet. The hall seemed to float in a suspended moment where power dynamics shifted irrevocably. The music, imbued with the spirit of his departed mother and the silent testimonies of years of exclusion, transformed the space into an arena of emotional reckoning. Faces in the crowd softened, eyes widened in disbelief, and even director Cartwright, whose earlier words had been designed to humiliate, was rendered speechless, his earlier mirth dissolving into a heavy silence of awe. Elijah did not smile or speak. His whole being, expressed through each note he played, recounted the indomitable spirit that had been suppressed for too long. The performance was a defiant declaration. Here was a soul who had, through the language of music, overcome the cruelty of a society steeped in rigid tradition. In that moment, the very essence of his existence was laid bare. Every struggle, every memory, every hope channeled into a symphony that struck at the heart of every onlooker. As the final note lingered and slowly faded into the quiet of the room, the auditorium remained enveloped in profound silence before erupting into overwhelming applause. The energy of that performance transformed an event meant to belittle him into a defining moment of triumph. A moment where the boy they had mocked became a beacon of quiet dignity and boundless resilience. The final note of Elijah's poignant performance still resonated in the air long after his trembling fingers had left the worn piano keys. For an agonizingly long moment, the entire auditorium seemed to pause in collective reverence. A silence so deep that even the persistent hum of the stage lights appeared to falter. It was as if every person in that hallowed hall had been transported from a world of careless mockery into one where raw emotion and unspoken truths began to redefine what it meant to truly listen. Then, almost as if triggered by a single, shared heartbeat, the silence broke. A wave of applause surged through the room, loud, heartfelt, and uncontainable. Phones that had been lifted mere seconds ago to record an anticipated failure now captured a different reality. Faces awash with tears, eyes wide with stunned admiration, and even the habitual smirks of critics transformed into expressions of quiet respect. In that very moment, the atmosphere shifted irreversibly. The cruel laughter and callous jeers that had once circled Elijah like a vulture's cry were replaced by collective awe and empathy. Director Cartwright, seated at the head of the stage, found himself rooted in his chair, speechless. His earlier remark, intended to ridicule and belittle, now rang hollow in the face of the brilliant, soul-stirring music that had just enveloped the hall. The director's eyes, which moments ago had danced with riotous mirth, now betrayed a dawning recognition of the power he had unwittingly unleashed. His face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and reluctant admiration, and for the first time in many years, he could not find the words to dismiss or undermine the young pianist's performance. Across the room, teachers who had once whispered about Elijah's problematic silence or dismissed his subdued demeanor as weakness now glanced at him with new eyes. There was a palpable, almost electric shift in the dynamic. Those who had once turned away in indifference or condescension now found themselves drawn to the vulnerable brilliance embodied in his every note. Some teachers, whose voices were usually laced with criticism when speaking of the quiet troublemaker, exchanged murmurs of disbelief. They realized, perhaps too late, that the very silence they had scorned was in fact a well of profound emotion and unmatched talent. In corridors outside the auditorium, the rumors began to ripple like an unstoppable tide. A handful of students who had always watched Elijah from a distance now approached him tentatively after the assembly. Their eyes were filled with genuine admiration and a hint of contrition. "I'm sorry," whispered one of them, barely audible, as another placed a hand on his shoulder in silent solidarity. The same classmates who had earlier burdened him with sneers and dismissive remarks now sought his quiet company, drawn to the transformative power of his performance. The auditorium's air was still charged with the echoes of every delicate note Elijah had played. Some students found themselves moved to tears, not solely by the beauty of the music but by the unspoken story that each chord evoked. A story of loss, of unacknowledged pain, and the enduring strength that grew in defiance of ridicule. It was as if that sound had summoned the very memory of his mother, a luminous spirit whose soft lullabies had once filled their humble home, casting her presence upon every heart in that room. In the days that followed, the reverberations of the performance did not fade into mere memory. The event became an urban legend of sorts among the students of Lincoln Heights Academy. In hushed conversations in the cafeteria and scattered chatter throughout the hallways, Elijah Walker's unexpected triumph was recounted time and again. No longer was he merely seen as the quiet, problematic boy from a poor neighborhood. He had become a symbol of dignity, resilience, and the transformative power of art. Even Director Cartwright struggled to reconcile his previous derision with the reality of what had occurred. His own office, lined with portraits of the Academy's esteemed alumni and steeped in the weight of tradition, now bore an unspoken question mark next to the legacy he had once guarded so jealously. The notion that a single, soulful performance could so swiftly upend long-held prejudices was humbling, and it forced him and many of his colleagues to confront the limits of their assumptions about talent, potential, and worth. As word of Elijah's performance spread beyond the school's austere walls, local newspapers and online community forums began to share clips of that historic moment. celebrating the quiet strength of a young man who had turned humiliation into honor. For many in the town, his music became an emblem of hope, a reminder that true beauty often resides in unexpected places. The performance resonated deeply with residents who had, themselves, faced the constraints of a society that prized conformity over genuine expression. In every retelling, in every shared snippet of video, one undeniable truth emerged. They had wanted to laugh at him, to dismiss him as different or deficient. Instead, they had heard something that compelled them to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about worth, dignity, and the power of unspoken voices. Elijah Walker's haunting music had rewritten the narrative in an instant, transforming derision into respect, isolation into community, and silence into a clarion call for change. In the wake of Elijah's unforgettable performance, the corridors of Lincoln Heights Academy transformed. What once were spaces filled with mocking laughter and dismissive whispers now breathed an atmosphere of tentative curiosity and newfound respect. The auditorium, still echoing with the residual power of each struck note, slowly emptied of its raucous energy and filled with hushed conversations that carried a tone of awe rather than ridicule. Immediately following his performance, students clustered in small groups outside the auditorium. Faces that had once sneered now wore expressions of quiet wonder. A cluster of freshmen, who had mocked him in hallways only days before, now whispered in low, respectful tones about the depth of his playing. It was like he was talking. One whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. "I've never heard nothing so real," murmured another, as if trying to capture the ineffable emotion that had washed over them in that luminous moment. Teachers, too, were forced into introspection. In the days after the event, several faculty members gathered in hushed conversations in the staff lounge. What had been dismissed as problematic silence was now reinterpreted as a powerful, unspoken language, a testament to the resilience and hidden brilliance of a young mind fighting against a system that had long marginalized him. Mrs. Dalton, one of the senior English teachers whose voice usually carried a note of perfunctory indifference when referring to Elijah, was overheard saying, "I never understood his silence until I heard him play." It was as if every note held the weight of a lifetime of emotion. Her colleagues, who had once exchanged knowing smirks at his expense, now listened intently, each silently regretting the years lost to prejudice. Even Director Cartwright, the very embodiment of the Academy's haughty tradition, found himself grappling with a cascade of conflicted emotions. In his austere, wood-paneled office, lined with portraits of the school's most celebrated alumni, he sat alone for hours after the morning's events. The playful cruelty of his earlier remark, meant to draw a laugh at Elijah's expense, had backfired in a most unexpected manner. Cartwright, whose authority was once undisputed, now fumbled for words whenever the performance was mentioned in faculty meetings. I underestimated him," he admitted quietly to a trusted assistant, his gaze fixed on the empty stage through a window. The pride that had once defined his vision for the school was now tinged with remorse, as he pondered how his own actions had contributed to an environment that stifled true talent. The transformation was not confined to staff alone. In the days that followed, Elijah began to notice subtle but tangible gestures of respect from his peers. In the cafeteria, an arena previously marked by sneers and whispered insults, he was once again approached by classmates. Some, with hesitance, offered apologies in the quiet corners of the lunchroom, their eyes downcast with regret. "I'm sorry if we made fun of you," one student murmured softly as he passed by, and another asked with genuine interest about the music he played, seeking to understand the emotions behind each note. For the first time in his years of silent suffering, Elijah found himself at the center of conversation, not as a subject of pity, but as an inspiration whose quiet language had struck a chord deep within the hearts of those who had once dismissed him. Social media soon became the modern-day town square where Elijah's performance was celebrated far and wide. Video clips recorded by students were shared on local community pages and quickly went viral, igniting a torrent of supportive comments and shares. Online posts praised the way his music had turned a moment intended for ridicule into a triumph of soul and dignity. Commentators wrote how his performance had broken through the rigid traditions of the Academy and reminded everyone that true art is born from struggle. The hashtags and viral captions, though not overtly tagged here, became rallying cries for those who had long felt marginalized by a system that prized conformity over authenticity. Within the few days of this uproar, whispers of change began to ripple through Lincoln Heights Academy. Meetings were convened by forward-thinking teachers who recognized that Elijah's raw talent and soulful expression could serve as a catalyst for a more inclusive culture. In one progressive meeting, a proposal emerged: a new scholarship and mentorship program to honor students who, despite socio-economic hardships, possessed exceptional artistic and intellectual gifts. The idea was informally dubbed the Walker Initiative among hopeful circles. A small seed of change planted in the heart of an institution long resistant to deviation from its well-worn formula. The school's once unyielding social hierarchy was now being challenged. The quiet, defiant notes that had surged from an old piano had awakened a collective consciousness within the academy. Even those who had once reveled in the comfort of their superiority were beginning to question the basis of their judgments. The halls that earlier had been laden with sneers and problematic labels now buzzed with an openness to understanding. Respect was no longer a currency exclusively reserved for the privileged. It was emerging as an earned virtue, one that recognized missed opportunities, hidden talents, and the transformative power of authentic expression. In informal gatherings after school and during breaks, groups of students reassembled to discuss not just the brilliance of Elijah's performance, but the deeper truths behind it. They talked about what had driven him so silently, about the life in a poor neighborhood, the love of a mother, and the relentless resilience needed to face a world that scoffed at his every step. With words surprisingly sincere for a group once sharp-tongued with ridicule, they began to see him not as the quiet other, but as one of their own, whose inner strength had silently weathered storms far greater than mere classroom taunts. By the time the sun had set on that transformative week, Elijah Walker was no longer a figure relegated to the fringes of Lincoln Heights Academy. He had become a symbol of hope, a beacon for those who believed that true talent and dignity could not be measured by the superficial criteria of wealth, status, or conformity. The memory of his performance echoed in hallways, in new policies under discussion, and in the tentative smiles exchanged between former detractors and those now willing to look twice. For Elijah himself, the experience marked both an ending and a beginning, a painful farewell to the isolation of his past and the dawning of a future where his inner voice, expressed through every delicate and defiant note, would finally be heard and honored. The seeds of change had been sown, and though the journey ahead remained uncertain, the impact of that solitary moment on stage continued to reverberate long after the applause faded into memory. The morning light that seeped through the tall windows of Lincoln Heights Academy carried with it more than just a promise of a new day. It bore witness to the quiet revolution that had taken root in the wake of Elijah Walker's transcendent performance. The assembly hall, once filled with derisive laughter and mocking whispers, now shimmered with a reflective silence. A palpable tension, this time not of ridicule but of introspection, had settled over the campus. As the first classes began, the corridors, usually impenetrable bastions of elitism and stale tradition, buzzed softly with hushed discussions and furtive glances that betrayed newfound respect. In the aftermath of that unforgettable evening, the impact of Elijah's music rippled through every corner of the academy. Teachers in their offices, once blasé and dismissive of the problem student, now flipped through his school file with a mixture of regret and intrigue, pondering how a boy they had written off as quiet and unresponsive could wield such force and vulnerability through his playing. The very sound of his notes, the resonant chords that had carried the sorrow of lost moments and the joy of undying love, continued to echo in their minds, casting a long shadow over years of hasty judgment. Mrs. Dalton, in a rare moment of academic humility, confided to a colleague that she now saw in Elijah the depth of character she had long ignored, realizing that his silence was not emptiness but a reservoir of unspoken emotions waiting to be expressed. Elsewhere on campus, the dynamics among the students underwent a striking metamorphosis. In the once crowded hallways, where gossip and snide remarks about his shabby clothes had been customary, groups huddled together to talk about what they had witnessed. A cluster of students, previously content with casting sideways glances at his quiet presence, now sought him out with cautious optimism. In one scene near the library's entrance, a small group surrounded Elijah as he steadily made his way to class. With hesitant eyes and voices trembling with the weight of remorse, one student finally broke the silence. "Elijah, your performance. It was beyond anything we could have imagined." The words staggered out, incomplete yet loaded with meaning. Another student added softly, "I used to laugh at you behind my friends' backs, but now I see how wrong we were." Their apologies, whispered and unsteady, created an atmosphere of tentative reconciliation and communal introspection. The transformation was not confined solely to the students. In the administrative offices, Director Cartwright, whose earlier comments had been laced with derision, now sat surrounded by a palpable hush as he rifled through the day's reports and overheard conversations. His face, once set in an imperious scowl, was now lined with perplexity and regret. Alone in his office, adorned with portraits of illustrious alumni and symbols of the Academy's storied past, he murmured to himself, "I underestimated him, underestimated the power of his truth." Such an admission, although unspoken to the rest of the faculty, signaled a subtle but undeniable shift in the leadership's perspective, a reluctant acknowledgement that tradition, when rigidly enforced without compassion, could stifle the very excellence it was meant to nurture. Between classes, whispers of Elijah Walker's transformation spread like wildfire through the campus grapevine. Teachers who had once scorned his quietude now shared knowing looks, and even the school's disciplinary records seemed to reflect an unspoken promise to look deeper than the surface. Some found themselves inspired to re-examine their own long-held beliefs about what constitutes proper behavior and academic engagement. In small gatherings at the cafeteria, which had long been dominated by cliques of privileged chatter, discussions turned to the talk of the day, how one young man's performance had not only disrupted the status quo but had become a catalyst for empathy. "It's as if every note he played peeled away layers of arrogance," said one teacher to another, her voice soft with awe. "And now, for the first time in a long time, we're compelled to rethink what we consider discipline and excellence." Even the campus security, who dutifully patrolled the corridors with an air of resigned indifference, began to offer nods or quiet salutations to Elijah as he passed by, a silent gesture of acknowledgement that he was, at least, no longer invisible. The media, too, had taken notice. Local newspapers printed front-page stories about the unexpected prodigy of Lincoln Heights Academy, and online forums buzzed with replays of the viral video capturing every emotional nuance of his performance. In coffee shops and community centers across the city, residents discussed not only the beauty of his music but also its symbolism, a potent reminder that greatness often resides in those who are misunderstood by conventional standards. By the end of the day, the transformation was undeniable. Former bullies, their faces etched with remorse, now mingled with those who had celebrated his talent. Some students approached him with genuine questions about music, his inspirations, and even his personal history. A quiet but persistent humility in his eyes revealed that while the cruelty of his past had shaped him, it had not hardened him. Instead, it had endowed him with an inner strength that now shone through brightly. Elijah listened quietly, nodding in acknowledgement and offering a faint smile, an acknowledgement that his heart, battered by years of neglect, was finally beginning to be seen for what it truly was. This profound change in the school's atmosphere would set the stage for even more significant transformations in the weeks that followed. A tide of reform spurred not by administrative fiat, but by the awakening of empathy among those who once reveled in superiority. The legacy of that singular performance was already rippling outward, promising to reshape not only the lives of those who had witnessed it, but the very culture of Lincoln Heights Academy itself. The following weeks at Lincoln Heights Academy unfolded like the first pages of an entirely new chapter. No longer was the once downtrodden Elijah Walker relegated to whispers and solitary walks through the chilly corridors of an elite institution. Instead, his performance had ignited a metamorphosis that extended far beyond the walls of the auditorium. What began as a single, soul-stirring moment on an old, battered piano quickly reverberated throughout the school, and eventually, the entire city. In the days that followed, students and faculty alike discovered themselves questioning long-held beliefs. The once immutable hierarchy of Lincoln Heights Academy had been upended. Morning assemblies, which had traditionally been filled with rehearsed recitations of honor and duty, now buzzed with conversations about authenticity, empathy, and the true meaning of talent. In lively debates by the water fountains and in hushed exchanges between classes, Elijah's performance, captured on dozens of smartphones, was replayed until its every nuance was etched into memory. Classmates who had once snickered at him now looked at him with a quiet reverence, as if the haunting strains of music had revealed depths of his character that words alone could not describe. Director Cartwright, who once wielded his authority with an air of untouchable superiority, found himself wrestling with an inner reckoning. The institutional pride with which he had long defended traditions began to crumble in the wake of a boy's raw, unfiltered expression of pain and hope. In hushed meetings among the senior staff, there was talk of change, a subtle yet unmistakable shift toward reconsidering what excellence truly meant. A group of forward-thinking teachers spearheaded discussions on incorporating more diverse forms of expression into the Academy's curriculum. They argued that, rather than silencing differences or labeling them as problems, the school should nurture the disciplines that allowed every student to reveal their inner voice. Slowly but surely, the phrase "the Walker Initiative" took shape, referring to a proposed scholarship and mentorship program aimed at supporting students from underrepresented backgrounds with exceptional talent in the arts and humanities. For Elijah, personally, the school environment began to feel less like an arena of judgment and more like a place where his uniqueness could be celebrated. In the days after his performance, he was approached not with derision, but with genuine curiosity and kind encouragement. Classmates, those who had once ridiculed his threadbare clothes and quiet reserve, now asked him about his musical influences. Over lunchtime, where he previously sat alone, invitations were extended for group study sessions and even casual conversation. An encouraging senior from a long-standing clique, whose own voice had often drowned in the chorus of privilege, remarked almost shyly, "You play like you're telling your life story. I wish I had the courage to be that honest about who I am." Words like these, spoken by those who had once been his harshest critics, began to rebuild his battered heart. Outside the campus, Elijah's transformation was capturing the attention of the local community. News outlets picked up on the miracle on the stage story, and soon local newspapers ran feature pieces on the unassuming young pianist who had silenced an entire generation of cynics with a single, heartfelt performance. Community centers and cultural organizations reached out, inviting him to perform at local events, celebrating his talent as not just a personal triumph, but as a beacon of hope for others facing similar struggles in the margins of society. His music, imbued with the memory of his late mother and the silent battles he had endured, resonated with those who had long felt invisible amidst the clamor of a judgmental world. In an unexpected twist of fate, an influential philanthropist learned of Elijah's story through a viral video clip and was moved to act. Within weeks, a proposal was drafted to establish a scholarship in his mother's name, a means to support bright young minds from impoverished backgrounds who might otherwise never have their talents recognized by an institution steeped in archaic values. The new Miriam Walker Scholarship, named after his beloved mother, aimed to provide not only financial assistance but also mentorship programs that celebrated resilience, artistic expression, and intellectual curiosity. Back at Lincoln Heights Academy, the change was palpable. In a special assembly convened by the reformed administrative team, Director Cartwright stepped forward with an uncharacteristic humility to announce a series of reforms inspired by what many now called the Walker Effect. For the first time in the school's storied history, policies were being realigned to honor differences in classroom contribution and creative expression. More importantly, the assembly ended with an invitation for every student, no matter their background, to audition for a new, student-run arts festival that promised to champion authenticity over mere conformity. When Elijah was formally recognized during the event, receiving not only a standing ovation but also a personal letter of commendation from the principal and heartfelt apologies from peers who now understood the cost of their earlier cruelty, the sense of vindication was overwhelming. For Elijah, the transformation was as much internal as it was external. While the whispers of ridicule that once haunted his every step had been replaced by murmurs of admiration and acceptance, he remained modest and inwardly reflective. In quiet moments, he would still sit at a corner of the school courtyard, pencil and notebook in hand, composing music in remembrance of nights spent by the old piano at home, notes that captured both his sorrow and his enduring hope. Each melody he penned was a tribute not only to his past but to the future he now dared to dream. A future where talent was measured by the strength of one's character, and where every silent voice could set its own symphony free. The ripple of change emanating from that pivotal school event spread far wider than anyone could have anticipated. In classrooms and community halls across the city, the story of a quiet boy whose music transformed contempt into compassion became a symbol of the human spirit's capacity to rise above adversity. It became a reminder that every individual, no matter how marginalized or misunderstood, holds within them a unique melody that can challenge the established order and redefine the meaning of excellence. They wanted to laugh, but they heard something that made them look at him differently. Subscribe so you don't miss stories that remain with you forever.